Okay, we're going to get started, everyone. Right, so Tina's now putting in these slides so that I remember to introduce myself because I'm terrible at doing that. Thank you, Tina. My name's Nicole Jones. I'm the Deputy Director of the Oceans Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today, both online and in the room. So this seminar is part of our expert series that we're running in the Oceans Institute. And we have today Abby Rogers as our expert. So just start with a couple of brief logistical issues. So if there is an emergency evacuation required, that you can exit either to the left or the right out the doors, and to James Oval is our muster point. And also that the bathrooms are located just at the your back right corner there, if you should need them. Right, the University of Western Australia acknowledges that its campus is situated on Noongar land and that Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. Before I introduce Abby, I'd just like to tell our wider audience here today what our vision is within the Oceans Institute. So the Oceans Institute is bringing together people across multiple different schools on campus and therefore across lots of different disciplines. And we all have this common vision of kind of creating something more out of our research and our teaching in the oceans area to produce a larger impact across the globe. And so we have a number of events like this throughout the year. And so we hope that you will join our mailing list so that you can be notified about upcoming events. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Abby Rogers, who is the co-director of the Centre for Environmental Economics and Policy at UWA, and a very important part of our Oceans Institute. Her work is highly applied and end-user driven, and she has recently been focusing on the non-market valuation of marine systems and integration of social and environmental values in economic decision support tools. And I, for one, am very interested in learning from her today. So thank you, Abby.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, so welcome everyone, and hello to those of you online. Thanks for coming along and taking some time out of your day to learn a little bit about economics that I hope will help you in your marine science futures. I just want to acknowledge a few people from our team in the Centre for Environmental Economics and Policy who have been part of various discussions in this space. Johanna Zimmerhackel, Dave Panel, who's here today, Michael Burton and Marit Kratt. And also some ecologists here at UWA, Thomas Wernberg and Karen Philby-Dexter, and Mark Meakin at Ames, who have also been bouncing some ideas back and forth in this space with us. So, a bit of background as to why we thought of delivering this seminar is that we've seen over probably the past 5 to 10 years a bit of an emerging interest in using economic approaches to help in environmental decision making for marine ecology in particular. So a lot of valuation of marine habitats, sort of ecosystem services and those sorts of things. What we are noticing with a lot of those papers that are cropping up are that they are led by teams of ecologists, and very rarely is there an economist involved in those processes. The challenge there is that sometimes it's a replication of things that they've seen in the literature, and it might be propagating some basic errors in economics. So what we would just like to sort of put out there is that really you need to have some basic understanding of economic theory to be able to deliver robust and defensible economics. And that there is a risk if you don't do that in misusing economic approaches and not interpreting economic information correctly. And when we're using this information to help guide our decision making about environmental resources, that could have some adverse outcomes. So first of all, to convince you of why we care about economics in the first place, economics is a study about efficiency. So in economics, we move beyond just thinking about effectiveness. So what is technically feasible in terms of an environmental program or policy or intervention, and what is cost effective in that sense, what's the cheapest thing we can do to achieve an outcome. We want to go beyond that because sometimes the cheapest thing that we can do doesn't actually deliver the best outcome. So we want to think about how we can maximise those benefits relative to costs that we're having to incur. And that's what economics does. So it thinks about the scarcity of resources. We know that we have scarce natural resources. We have a limit on how many of them we have access to. We know that many environments are degraded. We have limited financial resources, particularly when we're thinking about conservation strategies and investing in those. We don't have all the money in the world to do all the things we would like. And given those resources, we really need to be efficient in the way that we use them, in the way that we allocate money, and in the way that we allocate the resource itself, the natural resource, to different uses. And so that's where economics comes in to think about how we do this efficiently. How do we allocate things so that we generate those maximum benefits? And in doing that, we actually help to maximise the benefits to people. So we improve their welfare. The other reason that I particularly like economics as a discipline is because of its ability to help in terms of comparability of things. So it's a really useful platform to integrate. And when I say integrate, I'm referring to a range of different value categories. A lot of people have a misconception that economics is concerned with that orange circle there, the financial or market values only. And it's true that we use kind of this market system to try and organise our information, but we're not just focused on that. There's a whole discipline on environmental economics, which is concerned with these environmental values and how they intersect with these other types of value in terms of the market and social values. So economics is this intersection point. It brings together all of these values. It does that by standardizing them. So we monetize everything. We use that because then we're able to compare everything. We go from having apples, oranges, and bananas to just having apples. I guess the real key benefit from that is that when we're going into decision-making context, we're able to make trade-offs directly between the social and environmental outcomes of decisions with those financial outcomes as well. So we bring that environmental element to the forefront of the decision-making platform. Through doing that, it means that we can consider people's welfare, not just in terms of their financial benefits, but also in terms of the benefits that they get from the environment and other things. And so that's what economics does and is in a nutshell. One of the first things that you should know about economics is this total economic value framework. So this is the way that we categorise and think about value. First of all, notice that we aren't just focused on these use-related values. We have a whole section over here on what we refer to as use value and non-use value. So another misconception is that economics only deals with things like those markets and how people use resources, but that's not quite true. We reflect on other things as well. So under the category of use values, we have these direct uses, which include consumptive or extractive uses, things like taking fish out of the ocean to eat. Also your non-consumptive uses like recreation, surfing, diving, all of those things. Then we have the indirect uses. These are things like your coastal defence benefits that you get from having healthy, well-maintained habitats that help to protect your coastline from erosion and storm events. For non-use values, a really important one, we recognise that people think it's important to have healthy, functioning ecosystems. They want to know that threatened species are persisting and being looked after. People care about the environment in general. And so we recognise that through existence value. We also recognise that people care about maintaining that environment for the future, which is what we call about the bequest value. So we recognise that there's a whole range of value that doesn't necessarily imply that I'm going to go and use and interact with that resource, but I still care about it. We also have this funny thing called option value, which is reflecting that at this point in time, we don't know everything about our marine environments. There might be some funny little organisms floating around out there that maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now are going to be a really key ingredient to some medicinal product. So this is about maintaining that environment for some future use of it that we don't fully understand yet. So we can actually monetize all of these things, and I'll come back to how we do that soon. Another point actually that I would just like to reflect on here in terms of existence values is a bit of a philosophical debate that sometimes arises about recognising the intrinsic value of the environment. So existence value and economics generally is a human-based perspective. It's the value that people place on the existence of a whale shark. Intrinsic value is the value that the whale shark places on its own existence. So there is a philosophical debate to be had about that whale sharks are important for their own sake. But when we're moving into a space of decision making and we have to actually decide, are we going to do this or are we going to do that, that philosophical debate isn't very helpful, because until whale sharks can get up and tell us what they actually think that they're worth, we can't quantify that. There's no disciplinary base that can actually do that. Probably the closest that we get is through ecological models that might be able to think about, you know, the relationship of that whale shark to other things in the ecosystem, but that's still not a strict definition of intrinsic value. So just a point to note that we recognise there are such things as intrinsic value. Economics doesn't deal with those directly, and neither do any other disciplines. The closest that we get is this existence value, where we think about the way that people value those things. So now some economics 101. This is a supply and demand curve, and this is at the core of welfare economics. And so it's very difficult to do anything around economic valuation if you haven't seen this before and don't understand what this is about, at least in a basic sense. So what we So what we have here is the quantity of some good or service being produced on the x-axis and the price being paid for that good or service. We have a supply curve. This represents the marginal cost of producing that particular good or service. So this is the cost to the producer. Down here, if we think about a commercial fishery, for example, we know that the first few fish landed are pretty cheap to acquire. Okay, we don't have to go far offshore. The fish might be abundant, so it doesn't cost much. As we start to get more and more fish, we have to go further offshore. The fish are less abundant. Our effort increases, our costs increase. So it costs more per each additional fish that we land. So that's reflected in this upward sloping curve. Oops. Then we have a demand curve. This is downward sloping. This represents the benefit of each quantity of that good or service consumed to the consumer. We have the opposite thing occurring here. So when a resource is really scarce, there's not much of it available, there's only a few fish left at the supermarket, you're willing to pay more for that fish. When there are a lot of fish around, you've been eating fish for dinner every night and you're really starting to get a bit sick of it, you might still pay something, but not as much. So willingness to pay is related to the scarcity of the resource. In economics, what we're looking for is to get a market to equilibrium, which is the point at which these two curves intersect. This is the point at which the cost of supplying that given quantity is exactly the same as the amount people are willing to pay for it. Now, why does that matter? Because in terms of total economic value, what we're trying to measure, first of all, is this producer surplus, the benefit to the producer of supplying that thing to the market. So what that reflects is we've got the revenue of actually how much is paid for all of those fish landed. But obviously, there's some cost involved in actually going and getting those fish to the producer. So not all of that is a benefit to them. Only this part here, this triangle here, producer surplus, is profit. Then we have consumer surplus. This is the benefit to the consumer. So this is the difference between the maximum amount they would be willing to pay for that fish and the amount that they actually had to pay. So these two things, these two triangles, are what constitute total economic value or welfare value. So that's what we're looking for when we're referring to economic value. Obviously, that's all well and good when we've got a marketplace. Often with our environmental resources, we don't. So we've got a lot of public goods, natural resources that are just sitting there in the environment that we don't buy and sell and trade. So we can't refer to a price to work out what that willingness to pay is and to be able to construct that demand curve, which we need to do to be able to understand what that consumer surplus is. So that's where we have non-market valuation. So this is an area in economics where we look at how we can infer people's willingness to pay for changes in environmental outcomes. So we equate these non-marketed or intangible things to a monetary metric. We can do that through a range of different ways. We can look at people's behaviour in relation to the environment. So how often and how much people spend travelling to the beach, for example, tells us something about the value of that beach for recreation. How much people pay in a price premium for a house near the beach, again, tells us something about the value of being able to live in close proximity to that location. Sometimes we obviously have things that aren't going to be captured even through that association with a market. Those existence values in particular, the non-use side of that total economic value framework. For that, we use survey-based mechanisms where we ask people about their preferred environmental outcomes and how much they'd be willing to pay for those. We do that through constructing a contingent scenario, which is usually quite specific about what people are getting for the amount that they're willing to pay. One of the things to note is that with all of these approaches, they're grounded in economic theory and they work in this space of understanding people's disposable income. People need to make trade-offs between, for example, would I rather spend my free money that I've got floating around that's not being used on bills, would I rather spend that on going out to dinner at a restaurant or on some conservation program? So it's all grounded in this budget constraint. The other thing I'll just recognise is that I think some people sometimes get a little bit worried that economists are trying to commodify the environment. We're not trying to run around with a bunch of sticky labels and put price tags on things. All that we're trying to do here is to equate things, to standardise things, to understand what people's value is in an economic sense for these environmental resources so that we can bring them into those trade-off decisions and understand how they compare to some of those financial resources. So now that we've touched on a few things that are important to understand about economics, that total economic value framework, producer and consumer surplus, and that we have these techniques available to estimate values, monetary values for these non-market things, I'd like to touch on some commonly seen economic numbers that you might see in the literature and that are often misused or misinterpreted. So first of all, we often see reference to things about business revenues or expenditures. And a lot of the time people think these are economic values. So they're potentially maybe some sort of economic indicator, but they're not economic value. The reason why, we'll illustrate that with some work that I was actually involved in with Johanna Zimmerhackel and others. So in this study, she was looking at the value of the shark dive tourism industry as a sector to the Maldives. And so in the Maldives, there's sort of a bit of a need to think about conservation strategies for those sharks, whether they're more important to conserve for tourism, where they can persist in the environment relative to being fished. So through this study, Johanna went out and asked a whole lot of dive operators, a whole lot of tourists about their expenditures in the region and about the money received at the business end. So from that process, worked out that the revenue to those dive business operators from having shark divers come and use their services was 14 million per annum, a big number. Within those revenues, obviously businesses are being taxed. So some of that money is going through to the government and they might be using that to reinvest in the community in some way. So we can take out measures like the tax revenue, 7 million in this case. And we can look at the numbers of jobs, the jobs that are supported by that industry, and you know, how many of those might be local versus foreign workers, because we're interested in whether or not the incomes are staying in that local area or are being spent offshore, for example. So over 1,300 jobs, and most of those are local in this case. So useful information, but what sort of information is it? Recalling that consumer surplus, producer surplus graph, What we are measuring here is this square. It's revenue. It's the amount of money that's spent on the dive, on the local economy, whatever it is, depending on which level you're looking at. So that tells us nothing about the profit made to that industry. We can't actually discern that just from having information about expenditure and revenue. So the issue here is that those numbers about revenues, expenditures, they're really big numbers. They're attractive. It's really nice to have that in a headline, but it doesn't actually tell us if the industry is profitable. Is anyone benefiting from this? We don't know if the producers are any better off because we don't know if they've made a profit. We know absolutely nothing about whether the consumers are benefiting from this exercise. We know how much they're spending, but we don't know whether they've got a benefit above and beyond that. So this is not economic value. This is revenue and expenditure. So that's the first really important point to make, is to make sure you understand what these numbers are telling you and to make sure you know how to use them appropriately. How would you use these? I think rather than being useful for economic policy design, they're probably useful for social policy. So they do tell us things about how many jobs are being supported. They tell us things about those flow-on effects into the economy, about how much the government is benefiting from this to reinvest back into that community. And particularly those jobs and multipliers, when you're talking about regional economies or developing nations, sometimes we do really care about that because we have discussions about equity and distribution, and we want to make sure that, you know, many people are getting a bit of a slice of the pie. So it's fair to think that maybe your objective isn't always to maximise profits. It might be that you're happy to not be running at the highest level of profit for the benefit of having a few more jobs in some of those regional developing locations. But you still want to know that the industry is profitable. You don't want it running at a loss, and you can't tell that from these numbers. So the other area that I would really like to focus on is a really popular line of research that looks at the total economic value of the world's ecosystem services. So the inaugural paper in this line of research, probably a lot of you might have stumbled across before, by Costanza et al. In 1997, estimated that across all of the biomes in the world, across 17 ecosystem services, that they equated to $33 trillion per year. Really big numbers. That same year in 1997, GDP globally was 18 trillion. So put a little pin in that one, we'll come back to it. This line of work has been repeated and updated and I think drawn on many times across the literature by many other researchers. It's really highly cited. That first paper is cited over 10,000 times. These other ones probably just as many. So we're talking about tens of thousands of citations by scientists, not by economists. So when we go to one of the other papers, they updated their 97 stats in 2011 equivalents to look at how values might have changed over time. They standardized all of that in 2007 US dollars equivalent. So the original paper from 1997 equated to $46 trillion if you update that using inflation and so on. And the 2011 estimates cited in this paper are 145 trillion. So somehow it's grown by an order of magnitude of about 3 there. Again, really big numbers. They're great headlines. So what do these numbers mean? Imagine that you're on the set of some Hollywood blockbuster. You've got somebody standing there jumping up and down on the floor, waving their arms around wildly, going, hey, everyone, there's about to be imminent doom. Enter stage left, the bad guy comes in, guns blazing, explosives going off everywhere, the set's destroyed. Okay, what did the arm waving do to help resolve that imminent doom? Absolutely nothing. These numbers are a whole lot of arm waving. They're attractive, they're interesting. When we're trying to actually inform environmental decision-making, entirely meaningless. We can't use these numbers to tell us anything about trade-offs or to help us gauge between what we should be doing in the environment and what we shouldn't be. So they are not helpful from a decision-making perspective. I think that original paper in 97 did a great job of getting this idea of economic valuation on the agenda. A lot of scientists are now aware that the potential exists to go and do this, but the ways in which it was done are not entirely grounded in theory. And moving forward, we need to be doing a better job of that. So back to the 97 numbers, the 33 trillion and the GDP, 18 trillion. Given that a lot of the data that they use in this is drawn from those non-market valuation approaches and market information, obviously all of that is sitting within constrained budgets. We're making choices and trade-offs, and our willingness to pay should be sitting within what is available in our budgets. If the 18 trillion is representing the flow of money in the global economy in that year, it's interesting that somehow they come up with a number that's bigger than that. Why is that? A bunch of reasons. First of all, welfare analysis, this concept of total economic valuation, is a marginal analysis. The values within that welfare analysis relate to a very specific context. So we can only measure value in relation to a particular exchange that we've clearly defined. And that means that we can measure the total economic value for a change or some change in an outcome associated with an environmental resource. We can't measure the absolute total economic value of all ecosystems globally. What that really is, as one economist put it, is a serious underestimate of infinity. That's because we're dealing with a situation where we've either got all ecosystems or no ecosystems left. That's our change. If we have no ecosystems left, we've got no life support systems and we cease to exist. So it's pretty much infinity. Recall that graph again and the demand curve, and remember that willingness to pay changes with scarcity of the resource. And so this is the reason why we need to stick within a reasonable marginal bound. If we're valuing reefs and we've got a lot of reefs around, the value per hectare of a reef is going to be pretty small. If it's the last reef left in the world, there's no other reef around to replace that, the value is going to skyrocket. Another issue around this line of work is drawing on this process called benefit transfer, which is an okay process when it's done sensibly. This is basically where we rely on the primary data that's being collected elsewhere and extrapolate that to infer value for a secondary site. And we have to do that quite often because these non-market valuation studies can be quite expensive and difficult to conduct. You need a particular skill set. Being able to draw what's on data that's already out there can be a useful and convenient thing to do, and that's fine. But remembering that every primary study is going to be, if it's been done properly, it's going to be conducted in a very specific context. It might be, so we're dealing with a specific marginal change where the people who are making the valuation, telling you what their willingness to pay is, they're going to understand how many substitute sites there are and what the scarcity of that resource is. So they might be trying to estimate the value of one beach, knowing that there are 5 other local beaches that they could go to instead. So 6 beaches in total. When we start to extrapolate that, we can't really apply that to a situation where we've got one beach in that local area and it's the only beach. The value is going to be very different to when you've got 6 beaches to choose from, or one beach compared to the other 5 when we're moving to a scenario of one beach compared to 50 beaches that are within driving range. Obviously, the value of that one beach out of the 50 is going to be really small. So we need to think about that scale issue, and we shouldn't be extrapolating things out of bounds with that in mind when we're using these benefit transfer approaches. We can get quite sophisticated with benefit transfer, where we use things like meta-analyses. We can draw on a whole range of studies that have been conducted. Maybe there are 50 or 60 studies that have been focused on a particular thing, and we can synthesize from that some average values. And when we're doing sort of these regional, larger analyses of total economic value, that's a more appropriate approach to use. That's not the approach that was used in this line of studies. So in terms of scale and scope, again, you've just got to use common sense. So you can't take values that have been estimated. So we've talked a bit about scale, but in terms of scope, you can't take values that have been estimated for a really popular beach recreational site and then extrapolate that to some remote location. We've got a lot of people using some popular beach near a populated area, doing a whole range of things. Once you get into some other space, there's not as many people, they're not doing as many things. Might be a lot of existence value, but if we're dealing with recreation value, clearly those two cases are not alike. Similarly, we can't extrapolate it to other very unlike things. Something that has been done in some of these studies is to take the value of recreation for coastal sites, work out what that's worth per hectare, and then apply that to every hectare of open ocean. Clearly, the recreation that is occurring in the open ocean is very different to what's occurring on the coast. The other issue that crops up in here is a very mechanical one about double counting. As that name implies, it's about counting the same benefit more than once. This is a bit of a troubling one when a lot of the time these valuations are starting with a framework, the ecosystem services framework, and the way in which that framework is set up does lead you into a bit of trouble with double counting, because we've got these process-based services, the supporting and regulating services, which actually fulfill some process that is a means to an end. So it leads to these outcomes, the provisioning services and cultural services, which are, the food extraction, the recreational benefits and so on, that are the things that people actually care about. So we need to be careful when we're valuing these things that we don't estimate values at both ends of that scale at the same time. If you take, for example, the nutrient cycling processes by a reef, that's going to generate improved water quality and improve the health of the reef. That in turn is going to lead you to potentially improved enhanced existence value of that reef because it's healthier and working better. And so that should say recreational uses, things like, because of the improved water quality, a more enhanced experience when you go swimming, diving or snorkeling there. So you can't estimate the economic value of these things and also add to it the economic value of that nutrient cycling, because you're actually counting the same benefit. It's okay to do one or the other. Sometimes it's hard to define some of our outcomes clearly, and we might want to turn to defining that process and evaluate that, knowing that it generates these outcomes. And that's okay, as long as you're aware of this causal chain of processes and that you're not drawing on multiple points at the same time. The other thing that we can't do, that has been done, is to add up things that can't be added together. If we've got a hectare of reef that's been really important and valued for the existence values and the recreation, we can actually recognise that we've got existence value and recreational value for that same hectare of reef. Those two things can coexist at the same time. If we're going to mine that hectare of reef, obviously we can't maintain the existence and recreational value anymore because we've got rid of that hectare of reef. We can't add those two values up, but that does happen. So it sounds like I'm bagging this whole process of total economic valuation. It's actually a really useful process as long as you avoid those pitfalls. So those things need to stop happening, because otherwise we're not ending up with useful information. So we need to remember that total economic valuation is a marginal analysis. So it can only be done for a very specific, defined, predicted change in a resource. We need to make sure that the procedures we're using are mechanically correct. Don't double count stuff, don't add up things that can't be added together, and don't extrapolate to some ridiculous extent when you're using techniques like benefit transfer. If we do that, we're going to end up with those final numbers that aren't ridiculously far beyond any global GDP for that year, but that are reined into something that is actually within the order of the correct magnitude of the value of that resource. And bear in mind that these economic valuations can represent those non-market values, and that brings those to the forefront of that decision-making process. If we do it well, it's a really useful tool for decision-making. So just to sum up on a few of the key things that I think are worth remembering and taking out of this seminar are that we need to be careful about how we interpret and use those revenue and expenditure-based measures. They are not economic values. They might be useful for social policy design and those sorts of discussions, but they tell us nothing about producer and consumer benefits. Jobs is a political objective. Ministers love hearing about jobs. It is not an economic objective. We don't try to increase jobs in economics, I'm sorry to say. And remember that economics does consider that a whole range of things have value. We don't ignore and exclude those non-market intangible outcomes associated with changes in the environment. We can quantify those. We have a range of well-grounded techniques that have been in use for decades to be able to do that. So through that, we can work out what people's willingness to pay is for these resources. We do that to make them comparable. We're not trying to put a price tag on things and turn everything into a commodity. We just want to be able to compare these things directly when we're trying to make decisions and prioritise where our investment in environmental resources should go. There's always going to be competing resources for, competing uses for our resources. So that's where economic frameworks really come into their own in being able to understand what is the best allocation of use from that resource to try and maximise overall benefit. We don't pick and choose sides usually in doing that. We know that sometimes there will be winners and losers from a discussion, from a decision, and that obviously has implications for equity. It's something where we can identify who those winners and losers are that can feed into discussions of equity, but economics doesn't claim to solve that problem. We're just trying to work out how we maximise that overall benefit, the overall welfare to people. And finally, this is a bit of a dated photo now, but I'd just like to remind you all that we exist here at UWA. So there's our Centre for Environmental Economics and Policy, but we sit within a broader group of agriculture and resource economists in the School of Ag and Environment. So we're over in the old agriculture building and we're here. We're ready to talk to you all. So next time that you think you might like to try your hand at some economics or interpret some economic data, please do reach out to us and have a chat. We would love to hear from you. And I think one of the things I wanted to flag as well is that we actually happen to be one of the largest groups of agricultural resource and environmental economists in Australia. And that gives UWA a really unique opportunity that we've got this really nice blend of marine science expertise and access to environmental economists. So I think it would be really great to work together a little bit more closely, and also gives us, I think, a sense of responsibility that given we're co-located, we need to be leading the charge on avoiding some of these problems. Thank you. Oh, sure. Yes. Anyone online, please do type in your questions on the chat and they will be picked up.
Thank you so much for that. That was really good and very informative. I have a question related to the GDP part that you said, because yeah, I don't know very much about economics at all. And I just wanted to ask you, I honestly have no idea or have very vague idea of how GDP is calculated, but does it account for all those other values at all? So could that be a big difference between what was?
Yeah, no, the short answer to that is no, it doesn't. So it is the financial market-based part of that circle, and it's not really trying to tell you how well that money is being used anywhere. It's just there is this much money moving through. There is a move towards establishing these environmental accounts that will hopefully won't fully integrate those things into measures of GDP, but we'll have sort of systems of environmental accounts running alongside those things. So there's a recognition that they're not included at present and that we need to do a slightly better job of that.
Okay, I'm Steve here, part of the group here in at UWA. Just while you're thinking of asking questions, I thought I might just add something. I often have comments from colleagues in ecology or biological sciences that, oh, and you mentioned that, but perhaps I need to specify here, it's often misunderstood about monetizing the different natural assets we have. And monetizing may not be clear. When I was a student, I remember our teacher telling us money has three functions in any order. It is a means of exchange instead of bartering. It is a means of storing value. So you're not going to spend everything now, you put it in the bank, say, and so it's transferring time. And thirdly, it is a measuring stick. It's a way to measure value. And so in this particular case, it is this third function, not the first, not the second. But it also means that you cannot understand monetizing, endangered species as, and that's unfortunately how people will still understand is, oh, what is this financial value? So that's one thing I'd like to really emphasize. The economic value of something is not its financial value. It could be very different. That's the first point that I wanted to say. And following up the other question about GDP, I want to, so I totally agree with you, but there's this example that I find is quite illustrative. You cut a forest, you completely cut it down, what's it called, you mine it, and you transform it to wood chips or export it somewhere. By selling those wood chips, you generate money, and that goes into GDP. The loss of the forest is not accounted for because it hasn't been a paid transaction, and also it doesn't represent what we call value added. You take steel and glass and different things and make a car, and the value of the car is greater than the value of the different components, the ingredients to make it. So that's just an example. In fact, it goes even further. Someone blows your house up and you get it built again. It doesn't matter who, maybe your insurance pays for it. You rebuild your house. The cost of that, that goes into GDP. But the fact that the house was destroyed doesn't. So it appears that there's a gain when in fact you're just replacing something. I thought I'd say that, and we're all very aware of that. And in fact, some countries, I'll go a bit further what you said regarding some countries, I can't remember which ones, but there are about 3 or 4 of them. I think Sweden is one of them, where they have gone into what they call net national product, not GDP, which is gross domestic product. The net national product actually does take into account the values of the forests and the lakes and so on. If there's some of them are cut down, it's subtracted. And so the value that's being communicated to decision makers and to the public does take into account whether your forest has been mined or your lake has been polluted. It's water still there, it's polluted, that's the, but it's a small minority of countries are doing this. I just thought I'd add to that.
Thanks, Steve. I think it's worth flagging too that GDP is an accounting thing, it's not an economic thing. So it's good for monitoring what's happening over time. It's not measuring economic value either.
Have you done any work on the economic value of recreational fisheries, in particular import of fishing gear, outboard motors, boats, etc., versus the value of recreation, reduction in stock availability for commercial fisheries? That's from Lynette Beckley.
Sure. I think that Matt Navarro is probably the best person to answer that question. So we do have people in our centre who are working on the value of recreational fishing. I haven't reached directly on that particular topic. Would you like to add anything to that, Matt? Did you hear that?
Yes, we are looking into the recreational value of recreational fishing in different ways and incorporating biology and bioeconomic modelling and things like that. So it's a it's something we're really taking a close look at.
In terms of the total economic value, you had option value and existence value. How do you go about quantifying option value when, if you drew the horizon far enough into the future, it's sort of inconceivable what those what potential uses might exist in the future? Is it even possible to quantify that?
So I guess that one of the things that we tend not to really bother doing when we're thinking about that framework is the framework exists to make sure that we've thought of the fact that all of these values might be there. When we actually go and work out willingness to pay, we don't necessarily disaggregate between existence value, bequest value, that option value. Is more about defining that those things are there, that there are these types of values associated with these resources, and then asking people what their willingness to pay is, given some potential policy change or program or intervention. And so they take all of that into their decision process and tell us what the willingness to pay is without necessarily disaggregating that. Obviously, when we're dealing with time horizons in economics, we use the process of discounting. So if we're looking at the benefits and costs of doing different things, we recognise that you might invest in habitat enhancement now, but the benefits of that might take 10, 15 years to accrue. And so we use this practice of discounting, recognising that people like to have things now rather than having to wait for them. So we discount the future values, we bring them back to what we call a present value. So that's one way that we deal with trajectories. But yeah, that we kind of just don't disaggregate those values in that sense.
Do you ever find a sort of discrepancy between what people say the willingness to pay is and what actually people put towards it? So towards a species or conservation or something? So
that's challenging because a lot of the time there is no way to know what people would actually pay. And that's the reason why we have these, particularly those more hypothetical contingent methods, because they are for things that genuinely are not traded and sold. And as Steve pointed out, we're not trying to actually take money from people to work out what their value for these things is. We just want to understand how they value it relative to other things. So it's all about that trade-off mechanism. There have been studies that have looked at, when you do one of these and set up a voluntary contribution to some conservation program, do people actually contribute? There's always something you need to keep in mind, that people often say they'll do something and then don't follow through. And you do detect those issues. But all of that's known within like the best practice ways of actually implementing these approaches. And so you can take account of that.
Thanks. I'm just curious. I have a friend in New Zealand who works in aquaculture, and he said recently that they're putting quite a lot of money into blue carbon initiatives. How does that fit into this whole sort of economic model?
Yeah, so I mean, blue carbon technically in the way that it's being thought of at the moment is a market good. So the idea is that you produce carbon credits and they are bought and sold on a marketplace for people who have carbon emissions. So it's kind of a marketed good in that sense. Obviously, there are going to be, I guess, these externalities where the fact that you're removing carbon from the atmosphere helps in terms of social benefits associated with climate change. I guess that to be able to quantify those things well enough, we need to better understand what the impact is of having sunk that carbon and what that means for the climate benefit. A lot of the time, we find the application of these types of approaches, these economic valuations, non-market valuations, so on, is not hindered by our capabilities to use these economic approaches, but by the biophysical science that we need to understand in order to define those contexts that we have to work in.
When you're using these tools to assess so the value of the existence of an ecosystem, presumably who you're what I'm trying to say, who you are asking questions of to determine that value is going to affect the value quite substantially. For example, the evaluation of like an Australian ecosystem might be considered quite high from an existence point of view, because most Australians sort of don't want for the resources that exist in that ecosystem, but someone in the Amazon basin might consider it totally justifiable to burn that, to burn that down for agricultural land. Are there any tools within economics to, square that circle of the different valuations of different community groups?
So whenever you're doing something like a benefit cost analysis, you need to define who the relevant populations are, who the stakeholders are, and where you draw the bounds. In these sorts of studies, we do know, for example, if you're doing evaluation of the Great Barrier Reef, there's been work done on this where they look at what we call distance decay. People who live in Queensland obviously value it more highly than people who live over in Perth, because we've got other substitutes, we've got Ningaloo, but also, we're less likely to travel there. Our existence values still exist, but again, we probably prioritise the things on our coast more highly than we do the things on the East Coast. And so you see that effect, and you can think about that globally as well. So we know that these values decay as the asset becomes less relevant to the population as it gets further away. As to your question is, I think, probably pointing more at the fact that who has the right to have their values matter. Again, as I said towards the end there, economics doesn't try to solve issues of equity. It tries to talk about what the overall welfare is to all people involved in whatever we define as the bounds. And I think that's where you need to think about those social science, social policy type discussions. Yes, probably globally, people would be willing to pay so much to protect the Amazon that it shouldn't be getting burnt down. But you need to think about the equity implications for that, for the people who live in that area and rely on that for their livelihoods.
So the examples that you've given us today, Abby, are largely around publications and kind of research. I was curious as to how good we are in Western Australia in particular actually using these approaches as part of our impact assessment of a new development or
poor. There is an ongoing planning process that I hope will use these better. They tend not to use them a lot. And for example, in an environmental impact assessment, there is a section you have to address social, obviously you deal with environmental impacts, but it's very much from an ecological perspective, not the way that the community values those impacts that might result. You do have to talk about community or social impacts, but I think in practice, that's just a quick slap together qualitative discussion of impact usually, and none of this kind of robust quantitative approach that enables trade-offs between things. So it's not done particularly well in Australia generally. Certainly internationally it's done better. So we see, particularly the UK, they have, I think, requirements, Dave, is that right, in the UK Treasury Green Book to actually consider non-market values as part of their benefit cost analysis processes and things like that. At the Australian government level, they do talk about them in their guidance material, but it's optional as to whether anybody actually uses them.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was a
Thanks.
really, really informative talk. I've learned a lot, and I think everyone else in the audience has as well. And thank you so much for sharing the information on how we can contact your group for getting further advice as projects arise that we're working on that include this economic evaluation. So thank you so much. And yeah, please join me in thanking Abby.
Thanks.
Just a couple of plugs for upcoming events. So we have next week our Marine Heatwaves workshop on Thursday. And also after that, the UWA Research, Aims at UWA Research Symposium. So all of our PhD students in that program will be presenting a summary of their research on the 2nd of September. So please join the Oceans Institute mailing list so you are always informed about these events coming up. And thank you very much to Tina and Cora and Rob for putting everything together for today.